counter-narrative news sharing this clip of an interview with an utterly reprehensible, disgusting, racist older man who seems to be Tunisian. And in the interview clip on some street somewhere in Tunisia, perhaps in Tunis, he shares his far-right white supremacist views, this ridiculous racist construction as to how he thinks that black African migrants to Tunisia are somehow alien to Tunisian culture. It's just all just nonsense. The issues of race in North Africa and the Sahel region are really interesting and often very positive and beautiful, as well as having more problematic sides. In terms of phenotypes and shades of skin towards the darker, it's very much mixed. For example, in Libya, you have quite dark-skinned Libyans all across Libya, particularly in the south, but also in the north of Libya. Same in Algeria. A little bit less so, but similar in Tunisia, in Egypt as well. And that's not to discount the problems of internalized colonial nationalism and white supremacy. Rather, the counter opposite. It's to be very honest and blunt about all of this. Let's go to these disgusting comments and then some further comments after that.
واخلاقهم تصلح بهم في افريقيا ما تصلحش بهم في تونس.
كيفاش اخلاقهم؟
ها؟
كيفاش اخلاقهم؟
اخلاقهم مش اخلاق نتاع المغرب، اخلاقهم خاصه بهم هم.
انت تعرف منهم شكون هكا وشفت؟
نعم.
تعرف منهم شكون؟
نعرف منهم شكون. تاني جدي كان يجيب فيهم يبيع فيهم ويشري وقال لي نعرف شكون.
The first comment one would like to make is that what's happening is the victories of the right wing and far-right politics across the world. And that's reflected in what's happening in North Africa and in Tunisia as well. We're going to look at this in 4 or 5 different aspects. First of all, the historical. The roots of anti-black racism can be traced as well of the Arab enslavement of African people. And we're going to come to more of this later. And then that framework, it's disgusting, it's unacceptable, it's dehumanizing. But its framework of racism is not that it treats African people like chattel, like literally like animals, as what European colonialism does. Doesn't make it any particularly better, but it is an important nuance to state, because once European colonialism and white supremacy enters the kind of situation here, you have then a predominating global white power structure which dramatically deepens all oppressions that have hitherto already existed. So giving that historical context. Then secondarily, point 2, anti-colonial histories. As forces fight back, the oppressed colonized people fight back, they are unified actually by colonialism itself with other colonized peoples. In the situation, for example, in the Caribbean, and less so in East Africa and other regions in the world, British and French and other colonialisms literally traffic in human bodies of colonized people and put them together in the same place, like on the Caribbean islands, people from Asian and African heritage by force put there, and of course they find their common ground and the unity of experience and the unity of struggle. And the anti-colonial history is what it does then, particularly in the 1960s, and you can see this very much with Frantz Fanon, who's a African-Caribbean person from the former French colony of Martinique and the Caribbean, adopting the North African Algerian FLN struggle against French colonialism as his own. And then he's promoting this black revolutionary politics at the same time Malcolm X is, at the same time Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture is, at the same time figures in England as well, not least people like Roy Saw and other figures here, Jagmohan Joshi and others. So you have this anti-colonial moment and period. You have Nelson Mandela being trained in armed struggle by the FLN in that famous picture as well. You have the Black Panther setting up the international section in Algiers in the late 60s. So all of this is really healthy. But then to point 3, then the failures and the defeats of that radical moment since the 60s and 70s until today, the unraveling of that unifying process around concepts of black revolution and black resistance, etc., that sees its undoing by the victories of the right-wing colonialists and their liberal wings as well, and then the corruption and then the divisions that causes amongst the oppressed. That's point 3. And then to point 4, we come to the contemporary situation, where again we go back to what we initially said at the beginning, the victories of the right and the far right based on the victories of the colonial states' terror globally and within the West as well. And very much integral and central to all of this as it pertains to rising racism and fascism against black people in North Africa as well and in Europe is the NATO operation to destroy Libya in 2011, which was an explicitly, violently, viciously anti-black operation, which then stamps the global political cultural situation in and around that. It defines that. Criminalizing migration, destruction of a socialist state that's pan-Africanist and pro-black liberation. And then the victory of that and normalizing that new middle passage through the Mediterranean Sea, the exploitation of people in the human trafficking, the selling and buying of migrant bodies and black bodies in Libya, etc. So you have that as the 4th point. And then, so what is the framework? The 5th point, what is the framework going forward as a counter, as a counter position to all of this mess, as an antidote to this, as a framework for unifying and liberation? Well, one, it has to primarily be the understanding and then the exposing and the fighting of white supremacy as a form of colonial politics and colonial nationalism and culture. That has to be the first thing. Understanding how what Lenin, I suppose, called national chauvinism is to understand how this is the primary means by which global capitalism sees its victories and fights us back. We have to oppose that by opposing white supremacy, racism, as the vanguard kind of cultural political force of colonialism and imperialism. Second to that, so oppose white supremacy. Second to that, it has to be class-based. It has to be based on the poorest sections, that their unity and their liberation and their leadership. It should not be, none of this should be manipulated by any kind of privileged or petty bourgeois, middle class or bourgeois factions to play games with this for their own self-interest. That has to be absolutely fought back. And then around that, it has to be a class-based leadership and organization and strategy to bring them to power on a mass level. The third point is unity around that, to unify the forces led by anti-white supremacy, a radical revolutionary black-led force that unifies constantly. Now we're going to go to a clip from Muammar Gaddafi, who led the socialist state in Libya, the pan-Arab, pan-Africanist, third world radical socialist state in Libya for 41 years, which was destroyed by the NATO operation in 2011. Gaddafi here apologizes to African people for the Arab involvement in racism against African people and also their enslavement and their whole dehumanization around that. It's an interesting clip. Let's go to the clip and there's some comments about that.
أنا أدين وأقدم باسم العرب الاعتذار والتأسف الشديد للسلوك الذي سلكه العرب وخاصة الأغنياء منهم اتجاه أخوانهم الأفارقة. لقد مارسوا أغنياء العرب في الماضي ممارسة مخجلة اتجاه أخوانهم الأفارقة، حيث شروا الأطفال وجلبوهم إلى شمال أفريقيا وإلى الجزيرة العربية وبقية المناطق العربية التي تقع بين هذين الإقليمين، واستعبدوهم وباعوهم واشتروهم وباعوهم ومارسوا الرق
ومارسوا تجارة البشر بشكل مشين. الحقيقة نحن نخجل أمام أخواننا الأفارقة عندما نتذكر هذا، يعني نخجل للذين مارسوا هذه الممارسة، وخاصة أغنياء العرب الذين نظروا لإخوانهم الأفارقة نظرة العبودية والدونية، وهذا لا يختلف عن عمله الغرب من أمريكا إلى أوروبا اتجاه الأفارقة، عندما عاملوهم في البداية كحيوانات واصطادوهم اصطياد، ثم عاملوهم كعبيد، ثم عاملوهم كمستعمرين، استعمروهم واستغلوهم حتى هذا اليوم. فأنا أقدم الحقيقة الاعتذار والأسف لتلك الممارسات.
It's wonderful to see an Arabized, I mean, he was he was Berber actually and Bedouin, but an Arabized North African who understands the nuances of white supremacy and historic racism and Arab chauvinism around that, to apologize in that way in front of the leader of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a trashy client operator for the British and the US, an absolute racist, and also in front of President Assad of Syria, which Gaddafi was a close comrade and ally of. But, oh my goodness, the Syrian government is utterly anti-black and racist as well. And it's part of the vanguard of the global far-right movement, actually, as we can see quite clearly in their close associations with Alexander Dugin and Nick Griffin, and also David Duke. Now, my own personal experiences, which is relevant here, I knew the Libyan socialist leadership forces since the late 90s. And also I went to Libya 3 times during the NATO operation against it in 2011 to stand with the black resistance and the African and the Libyan resistance against that. And there is problematics here. Of course there are. When Gaddafi invites black migrants to Libya to have a dignified existence, of course there's going to be some racist resentment amongst some racists amongst the Libyan population. And also, Bob Brown, which is Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Touré's close comrade, of which that we have good close political relations, also said that they warned Gaddafi that, listen, you're going to have some problems around this, which you are. Nevertheless, the process of unity is difficult, and it's not easy, and it's not smooth. But in my experience, the Libyan socialist leadership were very supportive of black unity, would give all manner of support, and this was reflected in the February 2011 conference where Muammar Gaddafi meets the only male heir to Malcolm X, Malcolm Shabazz, who unfortunately died in an incident in Mexico a few years after that. But Gaddafi hosts a Pan-Africanist black radical conference, and he wanted to support it, and he vested his state often in giving financial and practical support to that. So but there were some problematics. Also, Gaddafi also had relations with the global far right, wrongly seeing them as an anti-capitalist and anti-Zionist force, which they posture as, but they're not actually. And anyway, that's another connected issue. But one has to be very truthful and honest. As Amilcar Cabral says, tell no lies, claim no easy victories. There's no point being deceitful and manipulative. Put everything on the table and deal with reality. We cannot engage with reality objectively unless we are very objective about the reality. But nevertheless, Gaddafi's leadership and that of the Libyan socialist state, which is called the Jamahiriya, was a really important radical contribution, this notwithstanding its contradictions and problematics. So these are really important things for people to think about today as our communities become more fragmented and alienated and weaker as we go forward, as the oppression and the exploitation pressures upon us increasingly. We have to revisit this and just hold the line and hold the flag high and proudly and say these are our real histories, our ethical revolutionary ethics and principles and ideologies and experiences that will not go away because the class struggle exists, but with the absence of the organizational and leadership capacities that we once have that have to be rebuilt. Many thanks.